Good evening, and welcome to the late night hour. I'm Visage, and you're tuning into my late night show, where the night is ours to explore. Whether you're winding down or just getting started, I'm here to keep you company in the stillness of the dark. Tonight, I have an intriguing story to share, one that weaves tension and mystery, or leaves you curious about what lurks in the shadows. If you have a story of your own, send it my way, and I'll read it for you. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's venture into the enchanting unknown together. Let's begin, shall we? Hi there, my name's Visage, and I like to read horror stories, and I also like to create and write horror stories. I'm still getting the hang of all this on YouTube, but I just want to create and I just want to share. And if you have stories that you want to share, horror stories, short stories, then do share them with me, and I would love to read them out for you. The Grinning Man. It started small, like most strange things do. I would catch a glimpse of him in the crowd, a man standing still among the sea of moving people. The first time I saw him, I didn't even pay much attention. I was walking home from my late night shift at the gas station, kind of tired that sinks into your bones, and he was just there, standing at the corner of the street, watching me. The first time, I brushed it off. I hurried past him, assuming he was just another late night creep. But the next night, there he was again, the same man, in the same spot. This time, a little closer, his eyes locked on me like he'd been waiting, tracking my every step. My stomach tightened, a deep sense of unease curling through me, but I ignored it, telling myself I was just tired. It wasn't until I started seeing him everywhere that I realized something was horribly wrong. I would spot him across the street from my apartment, outside the gas station during my shift, even standing in the parking lot when I went out for a smoke. Always watching, always with that same eerie stillness. The worst part? No one else seemed to notice him. Customers, coworkers, people walking by. They would pass him without so much as a glance, as if he didn't exist. But I knew he was there, and every time I saw him, his smile seemed to stretch wider, unnervingly wide, as if his smile wasn't quite right, like his mouth was being pulled unnaturally far. By the time I saw him at the gas station that night, his smile was so wide it looked like it could split his face in half. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my work, telling myself that it was all in my head. But something about him was getting under my skin, gnawing at the back of my mind. That night, as I restocked the shelves in the quiet hours before closing, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. I stepped outside to empty the trash, hoping the fresh air might help me clear my head. And there he was, standing in the parking lot, just a few feet away from the entrance, his face half obscured by shadow, but I could still see the edges of that grotesque smile. My stomach lurched. I froze, the trash bag slipped from my mind. He didn't move, didn't blink, and slowly he raised a hand and pointed at the wall of the gas station. I didn't understand. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away, but I was too freaked out to think clearly. Without looking back, I stumbled back into the store, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. My heart raced as I glanced at the security cameras. There he was, standing just outside, staring directly into the camera. No, staring at me. His face pressed against the glass was a mask of shadows and teeth that smiled wider than I thought possible. I backed away from the counter, panic setting in. Then the lights flickered and went out. The store plunged into darkness. I stood there in silence, I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded too loud in my chest. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, a loud chuckle in the dark. I fumbled for the backup battery to turn the cameras back on. My hands were trembling so much it took a few tries, but eventually the screen flickered to life again. It was gone. I didn't feel relief. Instead, the air seemed thicker, like something heavy was pressing down on me. I had the sickening feeling that it was close, too close. I spun around, fear gripping me, but there was no one behind me. Yet, I couldn't shake the sensation of his presence like a cold breath on my neck. Without thinking, I bolted out the door and onto the street. My legs were moving on pure instinct, trying to put as much distance between me and the gas station as possible. I didn't see the car coming until it was too late. The impact knocked me off my feet, the road spinning in a blur of headlights and asphalt. Pain was distant, almost muted, as if my body had gone numb from the shock. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed. The beeping of the machine was the first thing I registered. My coworker sat next to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with concern. He told me how he'd found me lying in the street, unconscious, and called 911. Apparently, I was lucky. The car hadn't hit me as hard as it could have, and my head hadn't suffered any major injuries. I was bruised, shaken, but alive. He smiled with relief, but when I tried to speak, the words stuck in my throat, the memories flooded back, and I couldn't hold it in anymore. I've been seeing things, I croaked, my voice hoarse. Man, he's been following me, watching me. No one else seems to notice him. My coworker's smile faltered. His face grew tense, his eyes narrowing as he stared at me, and an uneasy silence filled the room. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. You mean that guy outside your room? Smiling? My blood ran cold. I whipped my head toward the window, heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see him there, waiting, grinning that grotesque grin. But there was nothing. The hallway beyond was empty. No shadows lurking, no figure watching, just a sterile stretch of white walls and pair of fluorescent lights. My stomach twisted, a cold knot of dread forming as I turned back to my coworker, confusion written across my face. I don't see anyone, I stammered, trying to make sense of what he was saying. But my coworker didn't look reassured. He glanced back at the door, his expression one of growing horror. He's right there. I swear he's watching us, smiling. My chest tightened, a deep sense of panic rising inside me. I didn't see the man. No one was there. But the fear in my coworker's eyes were unmistakable. He saw him. And in that moment I realized something horrifying. I couldn't see him anymore. But the man was still out there. And now, I think my coworker is next. The door. I only ever once told this entire event to someone. That person I held dearest to me, that I thought would understand me. They didn't. So, if people think it's a story, I might as well make it a story for you. When I was 7, my older sister Alice and I shared a room together. Instead, like a lot of siblings not liking each other, we got along very well. She loved to come up with stories and knew how to make the best setups for playing with our toys. I loved that we got to share a room. With our parents being busy with work all the time, we became quite creative around the house, building castles out of blankets, playing hide and seek, and drawing everything we wanted to. But one game was made by our parents. It was a rule to keep the doors shut in the house. I always thought it was because of the draft in the house when we moved in and the doors randomly shutting themselves. My dad said it was because it is more safe if ever a fire breaks out and it could protect us from flames. So, adding a game to the doors never seemed weird to me. My parents had us play the game Guess Who when they knocked on the door since we were little. A little odd, I admit, but still, we had our fun. The game consisted of guessing who knocked on the door. If it were 2 knocks, it was probably our mom. If it were 3 knocks, it was our dad. They did it in all kinds of places on the door, a little louder and sometimes so quiet you barely heard it. But we gotten so good at it that we immediately knew which one was who. At some point, they even had our cat Jenkins join. Those were nothing more than scratches. Mom would always get mad if Dad had the cat do it because of the damage on the door. Even Alice and I had our own knocking techniques. Hers were fast knocks, and mine were 5 knocks in a rhythm. But the knocks we heard that night on our door were none of them. 3 knocks. 3 slow, eerie knocks. Dad always used 3 knocks, but these sounded different. I thought Dad or Mom came and wanted to give us another goodnight kiss, but why would they do that when it was past midnight? It was a Sunday and we couldn't sleep, so we stayed up a little longer, but we weren't loud. We kept our voices down, knowing Dad had to get up even earlier than us for his work as a construction worker. But why knock on our door now if he could just open it and tell us to go to sleep? Something didn't feel right. I was not alone. Alice felt the same. The first 3 knocks, we just became quiet and went to each our bed, thinking it was a warning to just go to sleep. It became quiet and we didn't hear anything from the other side of the door, but also that no one walked away. Bang, bang, bang. Another 3 knocks, louder than the ones before. We are in bed now. We will be quiet. Silence. Another 3 knocks, like our dad's. Sweetie, can you come out for a second? We need to talk. Just like the other knocks before, it didn't feel right. Was Dad angry at us? Why was his voice lower than usual? Did he catch a cold? Dad, you can open the door if you want to. Silence. No, sweetie. I want you to open the door for your dad, please. Alice looked at me, and I looked at her, confused as she was. Oh, okay, I'm coming. She put her cover to the side and walked towards the door. Normally, when we were up too late, he just opens the door and gives us a warning. Yellow card, he named it. It was a little goof he would do when we didn't listen the first time around. He's always been a little loose on the rules on us, which made it even more confusing. Alice stopped in front of the door, hesitant to open it. Dad, you sound weird tonight. We are sorry if we were too loud. Silence. Open the door, sweetie. He sounded threatening now. I never heard Dad talk like this before. Alice looked like she started to shiver. No, you're scaring me, Dad. Alice looked back to me, and I nodded my head in support of her decision. She walked back to her bed, just as she covered herself with a blanket. Bang! We both screamed at the same time, but muffled it under our blankets. We decided to ignore our father and just stay in bed. Although we were still scared, we got tired from exhaustion and just fell asleep. The door opened and we jumped up in fear. Why are you guys still in bed? Get ready for school. It was morning. A sigh of relief came over me seeing Mom's face. We made it through the night. Mom, is Dad already at work? Yes. He left an hour ago. He didn't want to wake you guys. Mom, did Dad knock on our door last night? What? No. He was exhausted from his second shift. He slept through the night, honey. But we heard knocking on our door last night. When was that? Late at night? So you heard knocking in the middle of the night when you guys were supposed to be asleep. How about finding another excuse not to go to school, Allie? Come on, guys, get up. And just as if nothing happened, we got up, got dressed, and went on with our day. When we got home, Mom was still at work, but Dad was already in the living room. Hey, sweeties, how was school? I flinched at the word sweetie. Dad, why did you knock on our door last night? Alice looked even more agitated of him saying sweeties to us. What do you mean? I didn't go to your room last night. But you said you wanted us to open our door. Allie, I was asleep since 9 p.m. I didn't hear anything past that. What exactly were you dreaming last night? You knocked 3 times on our door and told us to open it several times. What? You were always the one knocking 3 times, but you did it so scary that we didn't want to open it. Dad's confused face became concerned. What did I ask you to do? To open the door for you. Dad's face became pale. I need you to come with me. He went to our room and stopped at our door. When did the knocking start? I think it was after midnight. He looked even more concerned. Guys, do you remember our safe word? Yes, it's don't. Say it. Just know that I know it too. And no matter what, I would never forget the safe word either. So no matter what happens, do not open the door after midnight until I tell you face to face that it is okay to open the door again. But why? I just don't want you to see scary things. Ever. Everything looks a little more scary at night. We didn't exactly understand what he meant by that, but we decided to just listen to him. A week passed and nothing like that happened again at night. Dad looked a little more tired than usual, but he always gave me and Alice a smile if we talked to him. The next day, Alice asked to sleep at a friend's place for a pajama party. She was always great at making friends. Me, on the other hand, felt more content by myself and had just a few friends because of that. But I love my sister, so seeing her getting invited to her friend's place just made me happy and proud. She was hesitant at first because she didn't want to leave me alone, but I told her I was fine. Don't forget what Dad told us, okay? Yeah, I'm gonna play on my tablet anyways, so no need to go outside of the room for that. I snickered, but her expression didn't change. She looked at me with concern. Really, I'm fine. Tell me how it was tomorrow when you're back. That night, I went to bed early, as I still wanted to read my book. I told Mom I didn't need anything else, and we said goodnight. Dad had to take another shift, so he was still gone. As I was reading my book, I started to feel heavy, losing focus and realizing it was time to call it a night. I hoped Alice had a good time. Even though I had the room all to myself, it felt a little empty without her. Knock, knock. I got ripped out of the sleepy state as I heard the knocking on the door. Honey, let the cat into your room. He's been in front of your door the entire time. Jenkins has always been a cat that you let into your room, and the second you sit down with him, he leaves. It became such a hassle that I didn't even bother anymore to open it. My mom could have just opened the door if she wanted to let Jenkins in. I must have been so sleepy that I didn't even hear her footsteps coming to the door. Nor did I hear any cat noises either. I started to get up and go to the door in my sleepy state and reached for the doorknob. Knock, knock. These knocks woke me up entirely this time. Sweetie, just open the door and let your cat in. Why would she say that when I was about to open the door? And why didn't I hear anything? The wood panels at our door have always been quite loud since it was, well, an old house. Dad always promises to fix the noise, but reschedules it every time. But I hear nothing. No sound, no breathing, no creaking on the floor. I've been paranoid since that first night, and I had the same feeling again. Is this how Alice felt that night when she went to the door? I didn't like it. What is the name of our cat, Mom? Silence. Sweetie, what game is this? It's Jenkins, unless you named him something else without telling me. Wrong. Mom always called him Jenny, because when we first found him, my mom thought Jenkins was a she, but he reacted to Jenny just as Jenkins, so used both names. Mom was the only one who used solely Jenny, which was our secret word we used for emergencies too. Even though that should have made me be aware of the situation, this isn't exactly the reason why I stopped in my tracks to open the door. It's something else, something we all decided to not say anymore, including Mom. Sweetie. That word that still haunts me and Alice. Our mom looked concerned when Dad told her why we don't like that word anymore. So why would she forget about it just 5 days later? Is this Mom on the other side of the door? Other than her voice, I heard nothing else. How can she stand there so quietly without moving? I must be getting paranoid from the last incident, but I just had this gut feeling that isn't going away. Mom, it is you, right? Again, silence. Why would she take so long to answer? Yes, sweetie. Just come and open the door for me, please. Sweetie. You're not my mom, are you? Silence. I could only hear my heart pounding louder and louder with each long second. You should have just opened the door. A loud bang, sounding like big furniture was thrown with full force onto the door. My heart dropped and I ran back to my bed trying to find my phone, but I didn't bring it upstairs, only having my tablet on the side table. The echoing hammer sounds become faster with each slam, making it sound like the door is about to break. The door starts to give out and cracks start to build on it. I close my eyes and start screaming, wishing I asked my sister to stay. A final bang, and then nothing. It became eerily quiet. Is the door broken? Did I just imagine all of this? No. No, I didn't. A drift. A drift that only you can feel when the door is open. Because our room is next to the window in the hallway, I don't know what to do. Do I open my eyes? I don't want to. I didn't want to see the person that was breathing loudly next to me into my ears. A foul odor I smelled. If I don't look, I will be okay. Just don't look. Lisa, look at me! My body slammed into the walls, making me look up in fear and seeing a face I was familiar with. It was my mom, but also not her. She looked at me with a crooked, grinning face, a grin I have never seen before, her hands clawing onto my shoulders as she held me up against the wall. I never felt this kind of pain in my life. She screamed into my face, and all I could do was scream back, "Mom!" As I said those words, with tears running down my face, I looked at her straight in the eyes. Her crooked smile vanished, like humanity came back into her eyes. She loosened her grip and whispered, "Run!" into my ear, and I did just that. Getting free, I started running past her out of the room. I ran and ran until I didn't. It was dark, and I couldn't see where I was, but I felt grass on my feet. I was outside in front of my house, surrounded by darkness. I saw a light coming towards me, a light I'm luckily familiar with. It's my dad's headlights. I fell to my knees, and all I remember is that I was getting cold and sleepy again. I woke up in a bed unfamiliar to me, with bright lights in my eyes, a hospital, and my father right next to me. My sister on the other side. Only one person was missing. Mom. My father never gave me a straight answer exactly what happened after I told him that Mom didn't mean to harm me. I knew, however, my mom was not coming back. My dad asked my aunt to let us stay at her place for the time being, and I felt lucky enough to not have to sleep back at home, that I didn't view as my home anymore. The exit on the right. Moving into a new apartment had always felt like a necessary evil. As a nurse, I'd lived all over, one cramped, impersonal place after another, constantly on the move. So when I found a reasonably priced apartment in an older building on the quieter side of town, I didn't hesitate. The idea of finally having some stability, a place I could at least pretend was home, was too tempting to pass up. The landlord, a tall, slightly balding man in his 50s, named Gerard, greeted me when I arrived to sign the lease. He had a certain warmth about him, a well-practiced friendliness that made me feel welcome right away. "You like it here," he said, smiling as we walked through the building's creaky halls. "The neighbors are good folks. Mrs. Klein, the baker, lives across from you. You'll smell cinnamon buns at least twice a week. And Mr. Peterson, down the hall, keeps to himself, but he's lived here forever." The building itself was old but charming. Wooden floors that creaked with character, walls adorned with faded floor wallpaper, and a grand staircase that curved around the entryway like something out of an old photograph. It felt lived in, worn in all the right ways. I'd moved enough times to know this place wasn't glamorous, but it had something many places didn't, a sense of history. Mr. Gerard showed me to the apartment. "Everything's pretty straightforward," he said, flipping through keys on a heavy ring. "Laundry's in the basement, trash chews down the hall, and, well," he hesitated for a moment as we reached the far end of the hallway. "One more thing." I followed his gaze to the door at the very end, a plain, nondescript door. The paint was chipping a bit around the edges, and the metal number affixed to it was faded. Unremarkable, except for the way Mr. Gerard seemed to avoid looking directly at it. "The door," he quietly said, "used to lead to the old exit stairwell, back before they renovated. It's sealed off now, though. The new exit's on the opposite side of the building. We never could remove the old stairwell, so we just locked the door and built the new one." was something about the way he said it. Something in the way his usually warm expression grew colder, more distant. Sealed? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, it's locked up tight. No one goes in there. His voice was matter of fact, but I sensed something unsaid beneath it, like he wasn't telling me the whole story. It wasn't my business though, and I didn't press him. I had bigger things to worry about. Between the night shifts at the hospital and trying to settle into my new place, the locked door didn't seem like it should be at the top of my list. But it was always there, a quiet presence at the end of the hallway. The last door on the right. Something about it gnawed at the back of my mind as the days went on. It wasn't like the door ever moved or opened. It stayed shut, just as Mr. Gerard has said. But every time I passed by, there was a strange feeling, an uneasy sensation like being watched. Like the door wasn't just part of the building, but something more. The feeling lingered, but ignored it. I had work, and I was too exhausted most days to think much of it. After long shifts, I've come home, eat something quick, and collapse onto my bed. But the nightmare started not long after I settled in. Dark, twisted dreams of smoke and fire, of children's voices crying for help. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, with the smell of something burning still clinging to my nostrils. It was too vivid, too real. One night, after a especially brutal shift, I came home late. The hallways eerily quiet. I was almost at my door when I noticed something strange. The door, the last door on the right, was ajar. Just a crack, but unmistakably open. I froze, the fatigue in my bones turning to ice. The door was supposed to be sealed, locked, inaccessible. But there it was, a sliver of darkness spilling out from behind it. I took a step closer. That's when I heard it, a soft, distant sound. A child's voice? Mama. My heart stopped. I blinked, straining to hear over the rush of blood in my ears. The voice was faint, almost like it was coming from deep within the stairwell, beyond the door. A soft sob, trembling, full of fear. I stood there for what felt like eternity, torn between instinct and logic. I was a nurse, trained to help, to run toward danger when someone needed it, needed me. But this felt different. Every instinct told me to turn away, to close the door and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But the crying continued, that small, pitiful voice tugging at my heart. I had to know. Hello? I called out softly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. I took another step toward, pushing the door open just enough to peer inside. The darkness seemed to swallow the light from the hallway, and the air coming from within was colder than it should have been, damp, stale. Then I heard it again. Mama, please. My pulse quickened. I stepped through the door down into the stairwell. The smell hit me immediately. Charred wood, like something had burned long ago and never fully faded. The walls were dark, covered in soot, as though they'd once been scorched by flames. My footsteps echoed in the narrow space as I descended, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The crying grew louder, more frantic. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. Children. More than one now. Their voices overlapping, calling out in anguish. I stopped halfway down, the weight of dread settling on my chest. The air was thick, heavy, with something I couldn't quite place. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing, distorting. I felt dizzy, disoriented, like I was sinking into something far darker than just a forgotten stairwell. That's when I saw them. At the bottom of the stairs, barely illuminated by the faint light filtering through the cracks in the wall, stood a group of children. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and hollow. Their clothes were tattered, burned at the edges. Their skin, their skin was blistered, scorched. The sight of them made my stomach churn. "We couldn't get out," one of them whispered. A little girl with hair matted to her face. Her voice was soft, barely more than a breath. "The door wouldn't open." I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't understand. What happened?" "The fire," another child said, his voice empty as if the motion had long since been burned away. "We tried to leave, but it wouldn't let us." A low, guttural sound filled the air, and suddenly the temperature dropped. The stairwell shook, the walls vibrating with a force that made the whole structure groan. I turned, bolting up the stairs, my heart racing in my chest as the children's voices rose behind me, their cries echoing louder and louder. "Don't leave us." I reached the top and slammed the door behind me, gasping for breath, the hallway spinning around me. For a moment, everything was still. The door stood shut, just as it always had. No sound, no children. I stumbled back to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and collapsed onto the floor. Was it a hallucination? Exhaustion? Or was there something worse? That night, I called the police. They were dismissive, bogged down with citywide protests, and short-staffed. They promised they would send someone eventually, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going back. The next day, I went straight to Mr. Gerard's office. I had to know. When I told him what I've seen, his face went pale. The cheerful landlord I met on day one was gone. In his place was a man burdened by a deep, gnawing guilt. "I hoped it wouldn't happen again," he said quietly, his voice heavy. "I hoped it would stay quiet." I frowned. "You knew?" He nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "I didn't always own this place. I grew up here. My family. They were here the night of the fire." I stared at him, the pieces slowly falling into place. "We lived on the top floor," he continued. "When the fire broke out, we tried to escape down this old stairwell, but the door wouldn't open. We were trapped. My parents, my sister, they didn't make it." His voice trembled, and for the first time, I saw the deep sadness in his eyes. "I was the only one who survived. I don't know how, but I lived with the guilt ever since." He swallowed hard, rubbing his temples. "When I became the landlord, I sealed the stairwell. I tried to make sure no one would ever have to go through what we did. But those kids, ones you saw, they were trapped there too. They never got out." I sat there in stunned silence, my heart aching for those lost souls. The children, their voices, their cries for help, they weren't just echoes of the past. They were still there, trapped in that stairwell, reliving that final moment over and over again. And no matter how many doors were sealed, no matter how many walls were built, that place would never truly let go of its ghosts. After that, I couldn't stay. I packed up and left. But even as I drove away, I could still hear them, soft, distant voices, calling. out from behind the last door on the right. And I knew they always would. The darkness in my room had a way of creeping in, swallowing up the familiar surroundings, turning the ordinary into something far more menacing. I lay in bed, back against the headboard, wrapped in blankets that felt like they weren't doing anything to keep the cold gnawing sensation at bay. The dim glow of my phone screen was the only source of light, casting long shadows across the room that seemed to flicker in time with my anxious heartbeats. I was on YouTube again, as usual, falling down the rabbit hole of horror stories, the ones tagged true, shared on Reddit by people claiming their lives were touched by something they couldn't explain, something sinister. I had heard them all before: footsteps in empty houses, faces at the window, dark figures seen out of the corner of your eye. But no matter how many times I heard them, they never failed to make me question my own surroundings. Tonight, though, something felt different. I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease and gnawed at the edges of my mind. The kind of feeling that makes the air feel heavier, thicker, like it's pressing down on you. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the video as the narrator described the person slowly realizing they weren't alone in their own house, that something had been watching them all along. My stomach nodded, and I shifted uncomfortably under the blanket. I paused the video for a moment, taking out and one earbud and letting the silence of the room settle around me. That's when I heard it. I froze, my breathing catching in my throat. It was faint, barely loud enough to be real, but I heard it. A soft tapping, like fingers gently brushing against glass. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, barely stirring the still air of the room. I stared at the shadowy outline, waiting, listening. Nothing. I let out a breath, shaking my head. My imagination, I told myself. I was getting too wrapped up in those stories. I reached for my phone to unpause the video, but then my hand hovered over the screen as the sound came again. This time, a little louder, a little clearer. The noise was coming from the window, unmistakably. My heart thudded hard in my chest as I stared at the motionless curtains, dread calling tight in my stomach. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to listen carefully. It had to be something outside. A bird, maybe? A branch? I knew that wasn't possible, though. I was on the third floor, with no trees outside my window. Then came a different sound. A dull, loud, low thud, like something soft yet heavy hitting the floor. And this time, it was inside the room. I jerked my head toward the sound, panic flooding my senses. My eyes darted across the room, but it was so dark I could barely make out the familiar shapes of my furniture. The dresser, the bookshelf, the chair in the corner. Everything seemed warped in the shadows, elongated, wrong. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to move, to explain the noise. Silence. Maybe I was imagining things. It wouldn't be the first time late night horror binges had a way of twisting reality, making every sound feel like it had a darker meaning. I tried to calm my racing heart, rubbing my hands over my arms as the room suddenly felt colder than before. Just as I was about to put my earbuds back in, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I froze, my entire body going stiff as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from behind me. I slowly turned my head, dread crawling up my spine. The wall behind me felt unrecognizable. The corners once familiar and comforting were now suffocating, filled with shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. My breath hitched in my throat as my eyes scanned the space. I could barely make out the closet door, which I could have sworn was closed earlier. But now, it was cracked open, just slightly, the darkness within it deeper than the rest of the room. I stared at the gap, my heart pounding so hard I thought might burst from my chest. There was something in there. I could feel it. A presence, cold and suffocating, watching me from the shadows. I didn't want to move, didn't want to breathe, afraid that any noise would draw it out. The door creaked, opening just an inch more. That's when I heard the breathing. Slow, deliberate, and much too close. It was coming from inside the closet, just beyond the crack of the door. Heavy, deep breaths that weren't mine. Sound filled the room, seeping into my skin, to my bones. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, breathing stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and oppressive. Then, the bed shifted, just slightly, like someone or something was climbing onto it. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My muzzles locked up, my fingers gripping the blanket so hard my knuckles turned wide. Slowly, painfully, slowly, I turned my head toward the foot of the bed. There, in the darkness, I saw it. A figure, crouched at the end of the bed, barely visible in the faint glow of my phone screen. Its form was wrong. Too long, too thin, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. And its eyes were staring right at me, glowing faintly in the dark, reflecting the dim light, like two pale, lifeless orbs. It was watching me. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, my entire body trembling. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze locked on me, unblinking, unwavering. It was waiting. Slowly, began to crawl, one hand, then the other. Its limbs moving in a sickening, jerky motion, like it wasn't used to the body it was in. Closer and closer, until I could feel the weight of it on the mattress, pressing down beside me. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it, and tried to unlock the screen, desperate for some kind of light, some kind of connection to the outside world. The phone flickered on just as the creature reached the edge of the bed, inches from where I lay. I bolted upright, fumbling with the phone as I dialed the first number that came to mind, any number. I had to get help. I had to get out. The phone rang, and then, finally, someone picked up. But there was no voice on the other end, just breathing. The same slow, deep breathing I had heard from the closet. I stared at the phone, horror creeping up my spine. I knew I should hang up, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't let me. The breathing continued, and then through the crackling static of the line, I heard a voice. I'm still here. The line went dead, and then I looked up from my phone. The creature was gone, but the closet door was wide open, and I knew without a doubt that it wasn't over. It was still there, watching, waiting. The cave. Steve and I had been talking about this trip for what felt like ages. Ever since we first heard the legend of the white grizzly bear, we've been obsessed. It wasn't just the rarity. Sightings were so infrequent that the They bordered on myth, but the stories behind it, the strange way locals spoke of the bear, they'd always mentioned it, sure, never linger on the topic. There was a tension when they described its movements through the snow. It's not natural, one of the old hunters had said. Something wrong about it. You feel it in your bones like the cold's creeping inside you. A little dramatic. We didn't care. We weren't hunting the bear for sport. We were after something far more primal. The thrill, the glory of discovering what no one else dared to approach. As we ventured, the mountains rose like jagged teeth before us, snow swirling in thick, unrelenting flurries. It was day 3, and our provisions were low, but Steve remained undeterred. His eyes were set, focused, and he had that look he always got when he was chasing something. Something he wouldn't let go until he had it. "You still think it's out here?" I asked, forcing a grin, but my nerves had begun to fray. The wind howled through the trees, the cold biting deeper than usual. The forest felt dead, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. "It's out here," Steve said, pointing ahead. "The tracks, they're fresh." I followed his finger to the indentations in the snow. Bear tracks, large and deep, weaving through the trees. We followed them for miles, a sense of isolation tightening with each step. The light was fading fast, the world around us dulling into shades of gray and white. Then we found a cave. It was carved into the side of a cliff, wide and gaping like a maw of some great beast. Jagged icicles hung from the entrance, and a deep, unnatural cold radiated from within. The tracks led right to it, disappearing into the blackness beyond. "This is it," Steve muttered, more to himself than to me. His breath misted in the cold air, hanging for a moment before dissipating. I hesitated. There was something about that cave, something ancient and wrong, like it was swallowing the light around it. But Steve was already moving forward, stepping inside without a second thought. I had no choice but to follow. The darkness inside was suffocating, our flashlights barely piercing the thick, damp air. The walls of the cave were smooth, too smooth, as if they had been worn down by not natural forces, but by something else, something with intent. And then the smell hit me, a sickly sweet odor of rot and decay, overwhelming in its intensity. It clung to everything, seeping into my skin, my lungs. I gagged, covering my mouth, but Steve pressed on, undeterred. We ventured deeper, the narrow passage twisted and turning in unnatural ways, always just barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. Every now and then, our flashlights would flicker, casting eerie shadows on the walls, making shapes that moved when we weren't looking. Then suddenly, the passage opened into a large chamber, and there, in the middle of the room, lay the bones. At first I thought they were animal bones, bear, maybe. But as we drew closer, the shape became clearer. The bones were too thin. And the skulls, there were several, were unmistakably human. Though twisted and warped, some were missing jaws, others had deep gouges in their foreheads as if they'd been split open. "Steve," I whispered, my throat tightening, "we need to get out of here." But Steve wasn't listening. He knelt by one of the piles of bones, his flashlight steady in his hands as he inspected something, a large claw, impossibly sharp, still attached to a skeletal paw. It looked like it could have belonged to a bear, but the size was wrong. It was too large, too deformed. "Jesus," Steve murmured, his voice barely audible over the growing wind howling through the cave. this is. He didn't finish his sentence. Instead, a low growl rumbled through the cave, the sound vibrating in my chest. We both froze, our flashlights flickering wildly as the air grew colder, unnaturally so. The growl came again, this time closer. Steve? But before I could finish, the lights went out. I heard Steve curse, fumbling with his flashlight in the darkness. Panic surged through me. I spun, shining my own beam around the room, but the light only caught glimpses of movement. Something large, moving impossibly fast through the shadows. Then, just as quickly as it had vanished, the light returned. I turned toward Steve, but he was gone. Steve? My voice cracked, echoing through the chamber. No answer, just the sound of the wind howling through the cave. Steve! I shouted, my breath wrecked, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a step forward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Over here. I froze. Steve's voice, soft, faint, but unmistakable. It came from deeper within the cave, echoing off the walls, but something was wrong. His voice, it was distant, hollow, like someone was imitating him. Like something was stretching his words thin, twisting them. Steve? I called again, my throat tightening. I am over here. Come on. The voice was wrong. It wasn't him. I took a step back, but the sound followed, this time closer. Don't leave me. I spun, shining my light in every direction, but there was no sign of Steve, only the bones, the cold, and ever-present growl reverberating through the cave. And then I saw it, something shifting in the shadows just on the edge of my flashlight's beam. It was tall, hunched, its body unnaturally thin, the elongated limbs that scraped the ground as it moved. Its eyes were black pits reflecting no light, and its mouth, oh God, its mouth was wide, impossibly wide, filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It stepped forward, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't walking. It was crawling, its limbs twisted at odd angles, moving too fast, too smooth, and from its mouth, that horrible imitation of Steve's voice. Come closer. Don't be scared. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the cave, my breath coming in racked gasps, the thing's voice chasing me, growing louder, more desperate. Don't leave me. Come back. The cave twisted and turned, and I couldn't remember which way we had come. My flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker as I stumbled through the darkness. Behind me, the sound of claws scraping against stone grew louder, faster. It was close, too close. Then miraculously, I saw it, the faint outline of the cave's entrance. Daylight. With a final burst of energy, I hurled myself forward, crashing through the snow and onto the open air. I didn't stop running until the cave was far behind me, the sound of the creature's voice fading into the howling wind. I collapsed, gasping for air, the cold biting into my skin. My heart thundered in my chest as I stared back at the cave. Its dark mouth silent once more. Steve was gone, taken, and I knew deep down that whatever was in that cave, it wasn't a bear. It was something far worse, and it was still waiting for the next fool to wander into its lair. The building across. The building across mine had always been an eyesore, a decaying relic of bygone era, standing stubbornly among the newer, shinier towers of the city. Its windows were cracked, frames warped with age, and the brick exterior had long since crumbled in places, leaving scars of exposed concrete and rusted metal. No one lived there anymore. Not for years. It had been condemned, marked for demolition, and in a matter of days, The wrecked crew would come with their heavy machinery to tear it down. Part of me welcomed it. That empty shell had always been making me, well, uneasy. Looming so close that the two buildings seemed to lean into one another. There was barely enough space between us to breathe. From my apartment, I could see right into the windows of the opposite building, as though the two structures were engaged in some morbid staring contest. I hated it. It was too close, too personal. It always felt like something was watching me from those darkened windows, even though I knew no one was inside. The building was dead. Still, knowing it would soon be gone didn't ease the tension I felt whenever I looked out my window. I tried not to think about it. I would return from work each night, tired and numb, and close my blinds without even glancing at the gaping windows across the way. It became a routine, part of the mindless action that filled my evenings. But one night, I forgot. I came home late, exhausted from another long shift, and the world outside felt like a blur. I tossed my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto my bed without giving a second thought to the blinds. I hadn't realized I'd left them open. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, the sounds of the city below washing over me in a dull, endless hum. The air was thick with heat, clinging to my skin in a way that made me feel sleepy, but I was not able to sleep. I really should have taken that shower before heading to bed. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable. Something nagged at the back of my mind. What was that damn building? Without thinking, I glanced toward the window. The blinds were wide open, offering me a clear view of this goodness, ugly building across the way. In the dim light of the street lamps, I could see it all too clearly. The rusted balconies, the crumbling brickwork, the yawning darkness behind those broken windows. It stood there, silent and looming, like a corpse waiting for burial. For a brief moment, I considered getting up to close the blinds. A strange, morbid curiosity kept me still. It was going to be torn down soon. What harm could it do to look just for a moment? And then I saw him. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow that didn't belong to the jagged lines of the building structure. My breath hitched in my throat, my eyes locking onto the figure standing on the balcony directly opposite of mine. He was there again, the same man I'd seen before. Tall and still, his body half hidden in the shadows. My stomach twisted as a cold wave of fear washed over me. I hadn't seen him for days, and part of me had hoped I never would again. But there he was, just as I remembered. Pale, creepy, and watching. I sat up slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. I told myself it wasn't possible. The building was empty, no one was supposed to be inside. It had been condemned, and yet he stood there, staring straight at me. His head was tilted, ever so slightly, as though he were trying to get a better look. I could feel his eyes on me, even from this distance, and the weight of his gaze pinned me to the bed. He didn't move. He never did, just stood there. An unblinking specter, fixed on me as if I were the only thing in the world that mattered. The following night, I tried to pretend it hadn't happened. I closed the blinds, locked my balcony door, and buried myself in my evening routine, doing everything I could to distract myself from the gnawing dread in my chest. But the feeling lingered. His presence, his gaze, it stuck to me like a second skin. Even with the blinds drawn, I could feel him out there, just on the other side. waiting. I told myself it would all be over soon. In a matter of days, the building across the way would be rubble. Nothing but dust and debris. I would never have to see those balconies again. Never have to leave those empty windows staring back at me. I told myself that. And yet the fear never really went away. On the night for the demolition, I made the mistake of looking out the window again. The blinds were drawn tight, but there was a small gap near the edge, just wide enough so to let a sliver of the outside world filter through. I don't know what compelled me to peek through it. Curiosity? Fear? Maybe something darker. Something that urged me to look even though I knew I shouldn't. I lifted the edge of the blinds just enough to see. He was there again, standing on my balcony? I froze. My heart slumped against my ribs. My breath catching in my throat. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. My mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no rational explanation. He stood there, as real as the night itself. His gaunt frame illuminated by the faint glow of the city lights. His eyes, those empty hollow pits, stared straight through the glass, looking onto me with a hunger I couldn't understand. Its lips twisted into that same weird shaped smile, stretched, too eager to get through this window. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the phone. I needed to call someone, anyone, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. But before I could, a low creak filled the air. A sound that sent a bolt of terror straight through me. It was the sound of the balcony door. It was unlocked. I stumbled toward the door, my pulse racing as I slammed it shut and twisted the lock. My fingers were shaking so badly that I could barely hold on. I stood there, breathless, waiting for some sign that he was still there, still watching. But when I finally dared to peek through the blinds again, he was gone. The building was torn down the next morning. I watched from a distance as the wrecking crew moved in, the machines tearing through the concrete and brick like it was paper. The air was thick with dust, the sound of collapsing walls and crashing debris filling the street. By noon, the entire structure had been reduced to rubble, and the vacant lot where the building once stood was nothing more than a graveyard of twisted metal and broken stone. But the relief I expected never came. That night, as I laid in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. Even though the building was gone, the space where it had stood still felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. An invisible weight pressing in on me, like the ghost of the building itself was watching, waiting for me to look. And though I told myself over and over that it wasn't possible, that the man was gone along with the structure, I couldn't ignore the feeling that his eyes were still on me. No matter how tightly I closed the blinds, I could feel him. He was still there.